Donald Whitaker was a man of discipline and ambition. At 40 years old, he had carved out his own empire in the restaurant industry, turning a small family-owned eatery into a multi-location fine dining franchise spread across New York City. His restaurants, known for their elegant ambience and exceptional cuisine, attracted high-profile clients, food critics, and celebrities alike. He had built his success from the ground up, working long hours, making shrewd business decisions, and sacrificing personal leisure in favor of his career. Despite the polished image he projected to the world, Donald's personal life was anything but glamorous. He lived alone in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city skyline, his only companion being his 14-year-old son, Kelvin. The space was pristine and modern, yet it lacked warmth, much like the man himself. Kelvin was a quiet, thoughtful boy who had inherited his father's sharp features but carried a gentleness that Donald seemed to have lost over the years. The two of them shared a house but rarely shared words beyond necessities. Their relationship was marked by an unspoken understanding. Donald provided for Kelvin's needs, and Kelvin, in turn, stayed out of his father's way. It had been like this ever since Rachel left. Rachel. The name still carried weight in Donald's chest, a ghost that lingered no matter how much time passed. She had been his world once, the love of his life, the mother of his child. He had married her young, when dreams were still fresh and love seemed like an unbreakable force. They had built a life together, filled with laughter, passion, and promises. But promises, as he had painfully learned, could be broken. Rachel's betrayal had been the wound that never fully healed. One day, she was the woman he trusted more than anyone. The next, she was packing her bags, leaving behind nothing but confusion and heartbreak. The discovery of her infidelity had shattered him. The late-night whispers, the unexplained absences, it all made sense in hindsight. She had left when Kelvin was just 10 years old, disappearing into a new life with another man, never looking back. Donald, however, couldn't move forward so easily. His love for Rachel had been deep, almost consuming, and her departure left behind an abyss that he tried and failed to fill. At first, he had told himself he would rise above it, that he would focus on his son and his business, that he wouldn't let the pain define him. But grief had a way of seeping into the cracks of a man's soul. He turned to alcohol. What began as a few drinks to numb the pain became a nightly ritual, then a dependency. Whiskey became his closest companion, the only thing that dulled the ache in his chest. He spent 4 years drowning in it, shutting out the world, including his own son. Kelvin grew up in a home where silence spoke louder than words, where his father was either working late or passed out on the couch, a half-empty bottle within reach. Despite his age, Kelvin understood more than he let on. He saw the way his father's shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking. He noticed how Donald flinched when someone mentioned Rachel's name. He felt the weight of his father's grief, even if it was never spoken aloud. And in his own quiet way, Kelvin felt sorry for him. Kelvin learned to take care of himself. He cooked his own meals, made sure his homework was done, and tiptoed around his father when the drinking got too heavy. He never complained, never asked for more than what Donald could give, because he understood that his father was broken. And yet, despite everything, Kelvin still loved him. Some nights, when Donald was too drunk to make it to his bed, Kelvin would carefully drape a blanket over him, pretending not to see the tear tracks on his father's face. Because even though Donald had failed him in many ways, Kelvin still saw the man he used to be, the father who once read bedtime stories, who used to laugh freely, who held his hand when they crossed the street. And deep down, Kelvin hoped that one day that man would come back. Kelvin had never known his father to be a happy man, not really. Even before Rachel left, Donald had been consumed by work, building his restaurant business into an empire that left little time for anything else. But after she betrayed him, he was a ghost of the man he used to be. It wasn't just the drinking, though that had been bad enough, it was the way he had shut himself off from the world, from life itself. Kelvin watched him go through the motions every day, waking up early, heading to the restaurants, coming home late, and sitting in silence, staring at nothing. Even after he had stopped drinking, Donald had never truly recovered. He had locked his heart away and thrown away the key. And Kelvin, at 14, knew he had to do something about it. One evening, as Donald sat on the couch watching a cooking documentary he wasn't really paying attention to, Kelvin sat across from him, biting his lip. "Dad." Donald barely looked at him. "Yeah. Do you ever think about dating again?" It was the wrong question. The second the words left Kelvin's mouth, his father tensed, his fingers gripping the armrest. His expression hardened. That same stormy look he always got when Rachel's name came up. "No," Donald said flatly. Kelvin sighed. expecting the reaction but still feeling disappointed. "It's been 4 years, Dad." Donald's jaw tightened. "I said no." And that was the end of the conversation. But Kelvin wasn't giving up. Late that night, when his father had gone to bed, Kelvin sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. He had spent weeks thinking about how to help Donald, how to push him forward when he refused to move on his own. And then, a simple idea had come to him. A dating site. Of course, Donald would never sign up for one himself. But Kelvin knew his father was still a handsome man, even if he didn't see it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes and a neatly kept beard, Donald had the kind of presence that women noticed. So, after a few quick Google searches, Kelvin found a reputable dating site, set up an account, and uploaded a photo of Donald. One taken at a restaurant event where he actually looked happy, smiling slightly as he shook hands with a chef. It was the most recent picture Kelvin had of his father where he didn't look completely miserable. For the profile, Kelvin was careful. He didn't lie, not really, he just framed things in a way that would make Donald seem approachable. He kept the bio simple: successful restaurateur, devoted father, and looking for a second chance at happiness. Then the waiting began. Every day, Kelvin checked the messages when Donald was at work. There were plenty of women interested, most of them older, closer to his father's age, but none of them felt right. And then he found her. Alice. She was 28, far younger than his father, but something about her profile caught Kelvin's attention. She was a psychologist who specialized in helping people recover from emotional trauma. She was petite, with delicate features, striking black hair that cascaded in waves past her shoulders, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through the screen. Her profile description was simple but warm. "Life is too short to be unhappy. I believe in second chances, in healing, and in the power of laughter. If you're ready to open your heart again, I'd love to get to know you." Kelvin knew, deep in his gut, that she was the one. So, with his heart pounding, he took the risk. He messaged her, keeping it simple but genuine. "I love your outlook on life. Would you like to meet for dinner?" When Alice replied an hour later with an enthusiastic, "I'd love to. When and where?" Kelvin nearly jumped out of his seat in excitement. Now, he just had to get Donald to the restaurant without him knowing he had been set up. That part would be tricky. Alice stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting the sleek red dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. The fabric shimmered under the warm glow of her bedroom lights, elegant yet bold. The perfect choice for a first date, or so she thought. She slipped on a pair of high heels, their sharp click against the hardwood floor filling the quiet space of her apartment. Smoothing down her long black hair, she applied a final touch of lipstick and studied herself with a small smile. Confident, sophisticated, ready. She grabbed her small designer clutch, checked the time on her phone, and ordered a taxi. As she waited, she couldn't help but feel a little thrill of excitement. She had gone on plenty of dates before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the mystery of Donald's profile, the quiet strength in his photograph, or the simplicity of his message. Something about him intrigued her. When her taxi arrived, she slid gracefully into the back seat and gave the driver the restaurant's address. An upscale spot in downtown New York, known for its intimate lighting and five-star cuisine. As the car weaved through the city, she pulled out her phone and composed a quick message to Donald. "Alice. Hey, I'm almost there. Can't wait to meet you." Smiley face. She stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. It was casual, warm, no pressure. The way dating should be. She leaned back into the seat, watching the lights of the city blur past, unaware of the chaos awaiting her. Outside the restaurant, Kelvin sat on a bench, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his head lowered. He knew what he had done was risky, maybe even stupid, but it had come from the heart. Now, as he waited to see the woman he had picked for his father, doubt crept in. What if his plan backfired? What if Alice got mad? What if his dad found out and never forgave him? The sound of heels clicking against the pavement pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up and saw her. Alice. She was stunning, more so than in the profile pictures. Her red dress moved elegantly with each step and her deep blue eyes sparkled under the city lights. But as she approached the entrance, her gaze landed on him, a small boy sitting alone outside a restaurant, looking utterly miserable. Something in her heart tugged. She hesitated for only a moment before walking up to him. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "What's wrong? Why are you sitting out here all alone?" Kelvin swallowed hard. His stomach twisted in knots. He hadn't planned for this part. Taking a deep breath, he met her eyes and said, "It was me. I'm the one who messaged you. Not Donald." Alice blinked. The words took a moment to register. Then her entire posture stiffened. "What?" Kelvin shifted nervously. I used my dad's picture and profile. He doesn't know about any of this." Alice's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She stood up abruptly, her heels clicking against the pavement with sharp finality. "You little troublemaker," she snapped. "Are you making fun of women? Is this some kind of joke?" No, it's not a joke," Kelvin rushed to explain, standing up quickly. I wanted to help my dad. He's been alone for 4 years ever since my mom left. He never smiles. He works all the time. He won't even talk about dating, but I know he's lonely. I thought if I could just—" "I don't have time for games," Alice interrupted, her frustration evident. She turned on her heel and started walking away. "You don't mess with people's feelings like this." Kelvin's chest tightened. Panic surged through him. He had to make her understand. "Please, listen to me," he called after her, chasing her down the sidewalk. "I just want my father to be happy. Our mother left us and my father has been suffering for 4 years. Alice stopped. Her shoulders tensed, but slowly she turned back to face him. There was something in his voice, something raw, pleading. She looked at him more closely now. His eyes were full of desperation, his face serious, older than a boy his age should look. She sighed. "All right," she said slowly. "Let's go see your father." But Kelvin shook his head quickly. "No. It has to happen naturally, unexpectedly. If he finds out I set him up, he'll never give it a chance." Alice crossed her arms. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Kelvin bit his lip. He had thought of this part on the spot, but now it felt like the perfect plan. "Here's the idea, Alice, you give me your phone. I'll take it to my father and tell him I found it. He'll post a lost phone announcement and then you can come to claim it. That way you'll meet by accident." Alice raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "That's clever. But what if he just hands it over to the restaurant or the police?" "He won't," Kelvin said confidently. "He's a responsible guy. He'll want to return it properly." Alice considered this, tapping her fingers against her arm. Then she sighed again, deeper this time. "All right, let's do it." Kelvin's face lit up, but before he could take her phone, she held up a finger. "One condition." "What?" "We do this tomorrow," she said. "Because if I know one thing about dating, it's that first impressions matter. And right now, your father isn't even at work, which means I'd just be handing my phone over for no reason." Kelvin hesitated, then nodded. "Deal." With a reluctant smile, Alice handed him her phone. "All right, kid. Let's see if your little scheme actually works." As she walked away into the night, Kelvin clutched the phone tightly, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. This had to work. It just had to. The next day, Alice stepped out of a cab in front of the restaurant, taking a deep breath as she smoothed her dress. She felt an odd mixture of excitement and nervousness. The plan was simple, yet the weight of what could come next sat heavily on her shoulders. Inside, Donald had already posted the announcement about the lost phone. He had found it on the floor of his restaurant the night before, left near the entrance, and had no idea how it had gotten there. Being the responsible man he was, he put up a notice both online and at the restaurant asking the rightful owner to come forward. Alice walked in, her heels clicking lightly against the polished wood floor as she made her way toward the bar counter. The warm scent of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air, creating an inviting atmosphere. She approached the bartender and, in a calm yet slightly playful tone, said, "That's my phone." Before the bartender could respond, a voice from behind her spoke up. "Is it really?" Alice turned, and there he was, Donald. He stood behind the counter, dressed in his usual button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. His blue eyes held a quiet intensity, but when he looked at her, something shifted. A smile appeared, not forced or polite, but warm, genuine. Alice was taken aback for a moment. She hadn't expected that kind of smile. There was no hesitation, no guarded distance. Just simple kindness. "Yes, it is," she said with a soft chuckle. "How can I thank you?" Donald waved a hand. "No need. Just glad it found its way back to you." Alice hesitated, then with a spark of confidence said, "Well, how about I buy you a coffee as a thank you?" Donald tilted his head slightly, considering it. He wasn't usually one for spontaneous invitations, especially from strangers, but there was something different about Alice. She carried an energy that felt warm, familiar, yet new. "All right," he said, wiping his hands on a towel and stepping around the counter. "I'll take you up on that." They found a quiet corner near the window where the city's soft hum filtered in through the glass. A waiter brought their drinks, and for a few moments they simply sipped in comfortable silence. Then Alice leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "So, tell me about yourself, Donald." Donald exhaled, glancing out the window as if searching for where to begin. "It's not a very exciting story. Try me." He gave her a small smirk before setting his cup down. "I own this restaurant. And a few others. I saw that much in the online reviews," Alice teased. "But what about you? The man behind the business?" Donald's smile faltered slightly. He wasn't used to people asking about him. After a brief pause, he said, "I was married once. Rachel. We had a son, Kelvin." Alice nodded, listening intently. "She left when Kelvin was 10, Donald continued, his voice quieter now. "For another man." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I wasn't exactly the best version of myself after that. I drank. A lot. Kelvin had to grow up faster than he should have. I put everything into work to avoid dealing with it. And now I guess I'm just here." Alice didn't rush to fill the silence. She let his words settle, giving him space. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Heartbreak has a way of making us forget who we are," she said. "But it doesn't have to define who we become." Donald looked at her, really looked at her. There was no pity in her gaze, only understanding. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him, like a door cracking open just slightly, letting in a bit of light. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent. They started as casual encounters, Alice stopping by the restaurant for coffee, Donald asking about her work as a psychologist. But soon, they became something more. Alice had a way of making Donald see life differently. She encouraged him to take breaks, to breathe, to laugh. She made him remember the man he used to be before the weight of the past crushed him. And without realizing it, Donald began to trust again. They became friends, real friends. The kind who could sit in silence without it feeling awkward, the kind who shared knowing smiles across a crowded room. But something was changing. Donald was beginning to see Alice differently. The way she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear. The way her eyes softened when she listened. The way her laughter made something deep inside him stir. He was falling for her. And it terrified him. Because love had betrayed him before, and he wasn't sure he could survive losing it again. Alice, too, felt something shifting. Donald was unlike anyone she had ever met, strong yet deeply wounded, closed off yet endlessly kind. But she had seen what love had done to him. She had seen the scars Rachel left behind. And she wasn't sure if she could be the one to heal them. Yet, despite their fears, something kept pulling them toward each other. And whether they were ready or not, love had already begun to find its way back into their lives. The shift in Donald and Alice's relationship was not sudden, but a slow, careful progression, like the warmth of the sun after a long, bitter winter. Their first outings were casual, almost incidental. Alice would drop by the restaurant under the pretense of craving coffee, and Donald would find himself lingering at her table longer than necessary, drawn in by the ease of their conversation. Over time, their meetings became more intentional. Dinners that started as simple gestures of gratitude turned into something deeper. Donald, a man who had once lived his life with rigid precision, began to make room for her in his meticulously structured world. He found himself waiting for her texts, his heart lifting at the sight of her name on his phone screen. When they were together, the weight on his chest lightened. She had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel significant, a quiet walk in the park, a shared meal, or the simple act of sitting together in comfortable silence. Alice, for her part, saw the transformation in Donald. The man who had once seemed so closed off, so guarded, now allowed her glimpses of the person he used to be. He smiled more. He laughed genuinely, without restraint. And when he spoke of Kelvin, there was no longer just the sadness of the past, but the hope of a future where he could be a better father, a present one. Kelvin noticed the change, too. At first, it was subtle. The way his father's posture relaxed, the way he hummed under his breath while preparing breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. Then came the bigger things. Donald started coming home earlier, not drowning himself in work as an excuse to avoid the silence of their penthouse. He asked Kelvin about his day, actually listening to the answers rather than merely acknowledging them. For the first time in years, the boy felt like he had his father back. One evening, as Kelvin sat on the couch watching them from across the room, he realized he could barely remember the last time he had seen his father this happy. It was strange and wonderful all at once. He had spent so long wishing for things to change, for his father to see beyond his grief and let someone in. And now that it was happening, Kelvin felt a warmth he had almost forgotten existed. Donald had been hesitant at first, afraid to name the feelings growing inside him. Love had failed him before, had shattered him in ways he was still piecing together. But Alice was different. She did not ask for anything more than he could give. She didn't demand parts of him he wasn't ready to share. Instead, she simply stood by his side, steady and unwavering, allowing him to come to her in his own time. And he did. Their evenings became their own little sanctuary. They would walk together through the city, the lights casting a soft glow on their intertwined fingers. They would sit on Alice's small apartment balcony, drinking wine and talking about everything and nothing, about dreams they once had, regrets that still lingered, and the fragile hope of a future neither had dared to imagine before. Donald shared stories of his past, of the long nights spent building his empire, of the sacrifices that had cost him more than he had realized at the time. Alice, in turn, told him about the people she had helped, the struggles she had seen, and the strength she had learned from others. They fit together in a way that felt effortless, as though they had been waiting for this connection all along. And for a while, it seemed like nothing could disturb their happiness. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It started with a phone call late one evening. Donald had just finished closing up the restaurant when his phone buzzed, the unknown number blinking on the screen. He hesitated before answering, a sense of unease settling over him like a heavy fog. The voice on the other end was one he had not heard in years. "Donald." "Rachel." His breath caught in his throat. His grip on the phone tightened. "I need to see you." The past, the wounds he had thought were finally beginning to heal, threatened to rip open all over again. And just like that, the fragile peace he had found with Alice was suddenly at risk of shattering. The evening was in full swing at the restaurant, the warm glow of chandeliers casting golden light over polished tables as the hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the space. Donald moved through the dining room with practiced ease, exchanging nods with familiar patrons, checking in with the chefs, ensuring everything ran seamlessly. It was a good night, one of many since his world had started feeling whole again. He had Alice. He had Kelvin. He had, against all odds, found something close to happiness. And then he saw her. Rachel. She stood just inside the entrance, her hands clenched at her sides, her dark eyes scanning the room until they found him. The moment stretched, endless and suffocating, as though the air had been sucked from the restaurant. Donald felt his entire body stiffen. His grip tightened around the menu he had been holding. His heart pounded in his chest with a force he hadn't felt in years. She hadn't changed, at least, not entirely. The years had touched her, softened the sharp arrogance she once carried so effortlessly. Her auburn hair, once always perfectly styled, now fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her makeup, usually immaculate, looked smudged as if she had spent the day wiping away tears. There were faint lines around her mouth, a tiredness in her eyes, yet she was still Rachel. Still the woman who had left him shattered and alone. And she looked broken. Donald swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe as she stepped forward. He had imagined this moment countless times, envisioned what he would say if she ever dared to come back. He had pictured rage, bitter words, slamming doors. But now that she was here, flesh and blood, regret written in every part of her face, he found himself unable to move. "Donald," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, raw and strained. Can we talk?" He should have said no. He should have turned his back, walked away. Instead, he found himself nodding, leading her toward a private corner of the restaurant, away from the curious gazes of diners and staff. He could feel their stares, the shift in energy. But he didn't care. His pulse roared in his ears as Rachel sat down across from him, wringing her hands together like she was trying to hold herself together. "I know I shouldn't be here," she started, her voice unsteady, "but I had to see you. I had to tell you the truth." Donald remained silent, his fingers curling against the table, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He wasn't sure he wanted the truth. Not from her. Not after all these years. Rachel inhaled sharply, gathering herself. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her eyes glistening under the restaurant's dim light. "Leaving you, leaving Kelvin. It was the worst mistake of my life." Donald flinched at his son's name on her lips. The anger he had kept buried for years simmered beneath his skin, threatening to spill over. "I thought," Rachel paused, shaking her head. "I thought I wanted something different. Something more. I convinced myself that I wasn't happy, that I needed to chase a new life. And I did. But, Donald, it wasn't real. None of it was real." Her voice cracked, and for the first time since she had walked out that door 4 years ago, she looked vulnerable. Truly vulnerable. Not the carefully curated expressions of manipulation he had once been so used to, but raw pain, regret, longing. Donald stared at her, his throat tight. "You left," he said finally, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You left without looking back." Rachel's shoulders trembled. "I know," she whispered. "And I've regretted it every single day since." Silence stretched between them. The weight of all the unsaid things pressed against his chest, suffocating him. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Rachel continued, leaning forward, her hands reaching for his before stopping herself. "I know I don't deserve it. But I want a chance. A chance to make things right." Donald exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over his face. His mind was chaos. His emotions warred with logic. This was the woman who had destroyed him, who had left him drowning in whiskey and self-loathing, who had abandoned their son. And now she was back, sitting across from him, asking for another chance. And the worst part? A part of him still remembered the love. The deep, soul-consuming love that had once defined them. He didn't know what to say. Across the restaurant, Alice had seen Rachel the moment she stepped inside. At first, she had only felt a faint unease, as if something was off in the rhythm of the evening. But then she had watched Donald's reaction, how his entire body tensed, how his face went rigid. And when she followed his gaze and saw the woman standing there, a wave of understanding washed over her. This was her. Rachel. The ex-wife. The ghost of his past. Alice had never asked Donald for details about Rachel. She had only learned what little he was willing to share, sensing that some wounds should not be pried open. But now, watching the way his world seemed to tilt in the presence of this woman, she understood more than words could ever tell her. She gripped the edge of the counter, resisting the urge to march over there and insert herself into the conversation. She hated the way Rachel looked at Donald, the quiet desperation in her expression. But more than that, she hated the way Donald was looking back at her, as if he was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or step away. But this was not Alice's battle to fight. Not yet. So she stayed where she was, heart pounding, waiting, watching. Hoping that whatever decision Donald made, it wouldn't cost them everything they had built. Donald lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the city lights flickered through the blinds. The hum of distant traffic and the faint ticking of the clock on his bedside table filled the heavy silence of the penthouse. He had barely moved in hours, trapped in the prison of his own thoughts, weighing the unbearable weight of a decision he never expected to face. Rachel was his past, the woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being. The mother of his child. They had built a life together, shared dreams, laughter, and moments so deeply ingrained in his soul that even after all these years, they still had the power to haunt him. There had been a time when he would have moved mountains for her, when her smile alone had been enough to erase his doubts. But that time was gone. The love he had for Rachel had not survived the betrayal. Her absence had carved wounds so deep that for years he hadn't even known how to begin healing them. But Alice had brought him back to life. She had been the quiet force that slowly, patiently helped him rediscover himself. She had seen the man beneath the hardened exterior, the man he had forgotten how to be. With her, he had learned to smile again, to hope again. She hadn't demanded anything from him, had never pushed, never asked for more than he was ready to give. And yet she had given him everything. Her warmth, her understanding, her unwavering belief that he was worth loving. And now he realized he did not just want her in his life. He needed her. As the first pale light of dawn seeped into the room, Donald made his decision. He could not change the past. He could not erase what Rachel had done, nor pretend that her return meant they could simply rewrite history. His heart no longer belonged to her. By the time he met Rachel at a quiet cafe later that morning, his resolve was firm, but that did not make the conversation any easier. She sat across from him, hands curled around a steaming cup of coffee, her eyes searching his face for something, hope, maybe. Redemption. But he had none to give. "Rachel," he began, his voice steady but not unkind. "I won't pretend that what we had wasn't real. For a long time, you were my whole world. And when you left, you shattered me." She flinched, her fingers tightening around the cup, but she didn't interrupt. "I spent years trying to understand why," he continued, his tone softer now. "Trying to make sense of how you could walk away from everything we built, from Kelvin. But in the end, I stopped asking. Because no answer could undo what happened. And no apology can change the fact that I lost something that day that I can never get back." Rachel swallowed hard. "Donald, He shook his head gently. "Please, let me finish." She nodded, her shoulders sinking. "I know you regret it. I believe that. But I can't go back to what we were. And I can't forget what you did. My heart doesn't belong to you anymore, Rachel." He exhaled, the finality of his words settling between them. "It belongs to Alice." Rachel's breath hitched, and for a long moment, she just stared at him. Then slowly she nodded, her expression crumbling. I understand, she whispered. I had to try. He reached across the table, a gesture of closure rather than affection, and gave her hand a brief squeeze. I hope you find peace, Rachel. I really do. That evening, Donald went to Alice. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached her apartment as if it knew the magnitude of what he was about to say. She opened the door before he could knock, her eyes filled with unspoken questions, with uncertainty. He had seen her that night at the restaurant, had seen the way she had stepped back, given him space, let him decide. And now he was here, standing before her, knowing with absolute certainty what he wanted. Without hesitation, he took her hand, cradling it between his own. I choose you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Alice, you are my true love. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a brief moment she didn't speak, as if letting the words settle into the spaces of her heart. Then a trembling smile broke across her face, and she let out a small, breathless laugh. Donald. He wiped away the tear that spilled down her cheek, his thumb grazing her soft skin. You saved me. I don't want to waste another second wondering what could have been. I know what I want. I know who I want. And that's you. Alice cupped his face, her fingers threading into his hair as she whispered, I love you. And when he kissed her, it was not hesitant or uncertain, it was the kiss of a man who had finally found his way home. Kelvin watched from the hallway unnoticed, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For so long he had waited for his father to make the right choice, not just for himself, but for all of them. And now, as he turned quietly away, leaving them to their moment, he knew. His father had finally chosen happiness. Donald and Alice moved forward together, the foundation of their relationship growing stronger with each passing day. The wounds of the past did not disappear overnight, but with every shared moment, every quiet reassurance, every brush of fingers across the dinner table, they built something new, a life neither of them had dared to hope for. They became a true family with Kelvin, not just in name but in the way they existed together, effortlessly weaving into each other's lives. Mornings in the penthouse no longer felt cold and sterile. Alice would wake up early, padding softly through the kitchen, making coffee while Donald read the newspaper at the counter. Kelvin, still half asleep, would stumble in, and Alice would ruffle his hair before setting down a plate of breakfast for him. They fell into these little routines naturally, their home filling with the kind of warmth that Donald had never thought he'd feel again. He had spent so many years in a state of numb survival, convincing himself that love was something fleeting, something that could be lost in an instant. But Alice proved him wrong every single day. She didn't just love him in the easy moments, she loved him in the quiet, in the struggle, in the pauses between laughter. And Donald, for the first time in his life, allowed himself to do the same. Rachel, realizing that her chance was gone, disappeared from their lives without another word. She had come back with hope, but she left with the understanding that some things could never be undone. Perhaps she had believed that love could be rekindled, that regret could rewrite history, but in the end, she saw it in Donald's eyes. He had moved on, and there was no place for her in the world he had built without her. The past had claimed its debts, and Rachel finally let go. Donald never returned to his old habits. The man who had once drowned himself in whiskey and regret no longer existed. He had learned that happiness was something to be nurtured, something fragile yet enduring. He no longer worked himself into exhaustion to escape the emptiness. Instead, he made time for the things that truly mattered. He spent evenings cooking dinner with Alice, something he had never done before, chopping vegetables while she teased him about his terrible knife skills. They would dance in the kitchen, laughter mixing with the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. Some nights, they would sit on the balcony watching the city lights, Alice curled up against him as he held her close. And with Kelvin, Donald was present in a way he had never been before. He went to school events, helped with homework, listened, really listened, when Kelvin spoke about his day. There were no longer unspoken apologies between them, no lingering shadows of disappointment. Instead, there was understanding, love, and a newfound respect for the father Donald had become. Kelvin was glad that his father had finally found his happiness. He had spent years watching the man he admired slowly unravel, consumed by grief and bitterness. But now when he looked at Donald, he saw someone whole again. Someone who laughed. Someone who smiled without hesitation. And most importantly, someone who had chosen to embrace life again. Alice and Donald often spoke about how unexpected love was, how it had found them when neither of them had been searching for it. Donald had believed himself incapable of opening his heart again, and Alice had thought that she had already seen love in all its forms. But together, they learned that love had no rules, no perfect timing. It simply arrived when it was meant to for those who were ready to hold onto it. And so, with the past behind them and the future unfolding before them, they chose each other every day. Through quiet mornings and late-night conversations, through laughter and tears, through the simple joy of being together, they built the kind of love that lasted. And this time, Donald Whitaker wasn't afraid to hold onto it.